Recently, I've received comments from 3 different people on YouTube who built their own version of my Cessna 172. I'll link to their channels in the description, but this has inspired me to finally build an improved version of it. Ever since I finished the original plane, there's been some things that I wanted to improve upon. For the new plane, I decided to 3D print an entire nose section to make it look more rounded and more like the real plane. I also wanted to place the horizontal stabilizer in a slot at the back of the tail, rather than glue it on top like I did on the original plane. I think this will make it look more realistic. I also wanted to experiment with fiberglassing, and after looking online I decided to cover the plane in 1 layer of 3/4 ounce fiberglass cloth and Minwax polyacrylic. I just bought the fiberglass cloth on Amazon. I started out by improving the 3D model in Fusion 360, and after the model was completed I cut off 1.5 inches of the nose in Fusion 360 and modeled a realistic cowling with an integrated motor mount, and I angled the motor mount down 3 degrees, and this is all going to be one 3D printed part. I'm using the same motor as before. It's an Emax 3506 650 kV brushless motor, and I'm just using this because I have another one laying around. The 3D printed nose is made of PLA, and it took about 12 hours to print on my 3D printer. I used the model in Fusion 360 to make foam board templates from Dollar Tree foam board for all of the fuselage and wing section panels. These can then be used over and over again if I want to make another Cessna 172. It'll just make it easier. Then I use these templates to cut out all the pieces from a 1/2 inch Owens Corning foam insulation, which I just got at Home Depot. I buy the small 2 foot by 2 foot square pieces that are 1 inch thick, and then I cut them in half, so then I have 2 1/2 inch thick pieces. I just buy these small pieces because I don't have a truck and I can't buy the giant 4 foot by 8 foot sections, even though it's cheaper that way. Similarly to my other planes, I assembled the fuselage in 3 sections, glued together all with Gorilla Glue and held together with masking tape while the glue dried. Once these 3 sections were assembled, I then glued them all together. I glued a piece of wood to the nose where the 3D cowling would screw in. Once I had the cowling in place, I began sanding the fuselage to match the contours of the cowling. I cut out the horizontal and vertical stabilizers from 1/2 inch foam, sanded them both down. Then I inserted a carbon fiber spar in each one just to stiffen them up. The landing gear will be mounted to the fuselage using 2 3D printed brackets, one for the main gear and one for the nose gear. These brackets are glued into a hole in the fuselage with Gorilla Glue. I then bent some 1/8 inch music wire into the shape of the landing gear with a little notch that slides into these brackets. Using the model in Fusion 360, I designed the airfoil sections for the wing. These are modeled after the NACA 2412. And I then 3D printed these out, and once they were printed I covered the edges in aluminum tape. This is so that when I go to hot wire out the wing pieces, the hot wire cutter won't melt the PLA. I then used my hot wire cutting bow to cut out the 5 wing sections. There's the 2 outer sections that are tapered, and then there's the 2 inner sections that are just rectangles, and then there's the centerpiece that goes over the fuselage. I glued the 2 outer sections of each wing half together straight, and then glued them onto the centerpiece with a slight dihedral angle. I then glued in the carbon fiber spars, then I sanded the entire wing down, and cut out the ailerons and flaps. Next, I covered the entire plane in 3/4 ounce fiberglass, and it made the plane very stiff, but in the end it would prove to increase the weight significantly, so I'm not sure if it's worth it in the end. I applied 2 coats of the polyacrylic and only 1 layer of the fiberglass. After it was dry, I began painting it. I started with 3 coats of white to the fuselage, and here I'm just using regular latex paint and brushing it onto the plane. I 3D printed out the shrouds that go over the main landing gear wire. These are printed as 2 halves and then glued onto the music wire using super glue. Next I glued on the elevator and rudder control surfaces. I used small Dubro nylon hinges glued into small slots in the foam using hot glue. The rudder has a carved cutout to allow the elevator to rotate. I had to have a pretty thick piece of foam in the middle part of the elevator just to keep it stiff enough when it's rotating around. There's also a small carbon fiber spar that goes through the middle part of the elevator. Using masking tape, I marked off the area to paint on the fuselage. The paint scheme is inspired by this picture I found online. I painted on 2 coats of the red and then 4 coats of the black stripe, and I used metallic gray paint for the windows. Rather than having the wing held on with rubber bands like all my previous planes, this one is going to be held on with bolts. So here I'm using 4 number 6 bolts, and these are 2 inch long. There's 2 3D printed brackets that are glued into the top of the wing, and then another bracket glued into the fuselage on the bottom of a piece of foam. For the fuselage bracket, there's a cutout on the bottom side where the nuts slide in, and then they're super glued into the bracket. So then the bolts will go through the wing and then screw into that. I added some small details like the Cessna logo and a small LED to the tail. This is not powered, it's just for looks. I then 3D printed out the end number stencil. So I used GIMP, which is similar to Photoshop, to make the letters and sweep them back. And then I imported them into Fusion 360 and extruded them out and then 3D printed out the stencil. I used a gray Sharpie marker to color it in and then traced it with a black Sharpie pen. For the wing strut, there's a 3D printed bracket that goes into the fuselage and into the wing for each side. And then a 1/8 inch steel rod is bent to attach to the 2 points on each wing and on the fuselage. I then printed out some fairings and glued them onto the metal using super glue. These are just 2/2, the same way I did the landing gear shrouds. After painting the wing, I glued on the ailerons and flaps. I used a Dremel to cut out a spot where the 4 servos would be glued in. I cut out a slot for the wires to run back to the center of the fuselage. The servo wire connections from the wing to the fuselage are made using one 3-prong XT30 connector for the 2 flap and 1 aileron signal wires, and then I used a 2-prong XT30 connector for the positive and negative 5-volt power wires. I put another strip of fiberglass over the servo wires just to stiffen it up so it wouldn't crack through the wing. For the control horns, here I'm just using ID card plastic. I bought a whole bunch of blank ID cards and I've just been cutting them up and using them for a while. I used a ruler taped to the control surfaces to make sure they were straight when I put on the push rods. And then after doing some small touch-up paint, the plane was pretty much finished. It came in weighing over 1,600 grams, which is about 500 grams heavier than my previous Cessna 172. But it turned out looking very good in my opinion. The 3D printed nose really makes it look real and gives a seamless transition to the foam fuselage. So thanks a lot for watching. In the next video we'll be flying it. If you like this and you want to see me make more planes, please click subscribe, like, and leave a comment about which plane I should make next. I currently have a couple ideas on planes that I'd like to do, but I'm interested in what you guys would like to see me make. So let me know. And have a great day.